Morgan Freeman gives money to a homeless man, but his real gift changes everything. "Sir, I think you're in the wrong place." The words were a challenge, wafting through the frigid Chicago night with uncertainty and derision. Raymond leaned against the wall of an abandoned store, and a few individuals turned their heads, intrigued yet uninterested. His cardboard sign was lit by the lamps, casting lengthy shadows on the worn pavement. "Anything helps. God bless." The man who had spoken stood nearby, adjusting the sleeves of his costly coat, his face drawn into a half smirk. Evan Grant, a business lawyer, thought success was earned and failure was due to bad choices. Is respect based on wealth? Say 0 for yes, 1 for no. Raymond was just another failure to him. Raymond gripped his coat, suppressing the pain of shame. He expected only $1 and a moment of recognition, but got mocked instead. Before he could glance aside, another set of sneakers stopped near him, not hurried, not evading him, just standing. Raymond's breath caught as he looked up. Morgan Freeman stood under a flickering street lamp, his presence effortless and expression unreadable. He hadn't spoken, but he changed the air around them. Evan scoffed. He shook his head and said, "This should be fun." But Morgan turned his head and locked his deep brown eyes on Evan. His calm, commanding voice sliced through the strain. "Now, that's an interesting way to respond to someone in need." The street was quiet. Raymond gulped, his hands shaking. He was used to neglect. He was used to being rejected. But for the first time in a while, someone stood still. Someone heard. And he had no notion that the next few minutes would change everything. Because when Morgan Freeman speaks, people listen. And tonight, the lesson was just starting. The frigid wind howled through the streets of Chicago, swirling between the towering buildings and rattling the windows of the high-end businesses. Madison and Wells, a bustling junction filled with harried professionals, late-night commuters, and the occasional soul neglected by the city. Raymond sat in a corner of an abandoned store, his back against the frigid brick wall. The cardboard sign beside him, tattered, bowed at the corners, and hardly legible from months of wear, told a simple story. Anything helps, God bless. He was ignored, nobody halted, but one dude. A shadow spread across the pavement in front of him, disturbing the normal flow of pedestrians. Raymond squinted against the harsh glow of the streetlights, trying to make out the figure standing before him. The man wasn't hurried. He wasn't avoiding eye contact or pretending to check his phone to escape the awkwardness. He stood still, and he was looking right at Raymond. For a time, Raymond paused. He had long since ceased expecting compassion from strangers. Hope was a dangerous thing when you had nothing left to lose. But this dude was different. He cleared his throat and mustered a smile that barely reached his sleepy eyes. "Sir, could you spare $1?" The man took time to reply. He stepped forward slowly, his quiet power almost terrifying. Then he talked in a voice as rich as the history it told. "And what would you do with that $1, my friend?" Raymond froze. He wasn't sure what he expected. A courteous nod, a forced apology, or silence. But a question? That surprised him. He wiggled his fingers while fixing his jacket's tattered sleeves. He opened and closed his lips. How could he respond? A voice broke the tension from the side. "He'd waste it," he said. Raymond raised his gaze to see Evan Grant, the corporate lawyer who had spoken earlier, still nearby with his arms crossed. His cashmere scarf was tucked in and his pricey coat was buttoned to his neck. "That's what they all do," Evan said, his voice dripping with scorn. "Give him $1 today, and he'll return tomorrow for more." Raymond stayed silent, jaw clenched. He had gone through this before. The assumptions, the judgment, the sideways glances that reduced his entire existence to a stereotype. But before he could glance away, Morgan Freeman moved his head slightly, locking eyes with Evan, making the lawyer squirm. "You seem very sure of that," Morgan said, his voice calm but heavy. Evan scoffed. "Seriously? A guy like this isn't going to change with $1. It's just another handout." Morgan stared at him before returning to Raymond. He showed no pity, no bias, just a calm curiosity that was considerably more frightening than loud skepticism. "What would you do with that dollar, Raymond?" he said. Raymond's throat was suddenly dry. He'd been asked 100 questions, but never this one. The answer didn't matter to most. They only wanted to feel better and they'd forget him before the next block, whether they paid him or left. But this, he wanted the truth. Raymond's fingers gripped his threadbare jacket as he shifted on the cold concrete. "A coffee," he finally murmured, his voice raspy from the cold. "Something warm, maybe a sandwich if I'm lucky." Morgan nodded slowly, weighing each word. "A coffee," he murmured, almost to himself. "Something to get you through the night." Raymond was silent. He was at a loss for words. Morgan wasn't finished. "What if I gave you $10? Raymond blinked, surprised. "Would you still buy coffee?" Morgan said. Raymond paused. "Maybe save the rest for tomorrow." Morgan nodded again. He spoke slower and more deliberately. "What if I gave you $100? Raymond's throat lumped. $100 was more than coffee. Not just food, it was more. A chance. A question of what he would do with an opportunity, not just a handout. For the first time in ages, someone treated him like a man with a choice, not a beggar. Evans scoffed again, shattering the silence. "Oh, come on! What's the point of this little experiment? You think $100 is going to change his life?" Morgan looked to him, expressionless. He said, "No. Life won't change with $100. Then he took out his wallet, still looking at me. The air surrounding them froze. Raymond's breath hitched as Morgan reached inside and brought out a pristine $100 bill. "But maybe," Morgan said, handing Raymond the bill, "it can change a night." Evan was speechless for once. Raymond's hands shook as he glanced at the cash, not due to the money, but because no one had done this before. "Are you serious?" he inquired quietly. Morgan smiled slightly. "I wouldn't offer it if I weren't." But Morgan barely pushed it back as Raymond was ready to grasp it. "Only if," Raymond looked up, puzzled. "Help me tonight and I'll help you tomorrow." A simple ask. A promise in an offer. Raymond's chest tightened. He had been living in survival mode, taking anything he could to get through the day. But this was unique. This was more than charity. This was hard. His fingers curled into fists. Uncertainty warring hope, something he hadn't felt in a long time. Raymond made his pick as the city lights flickered, but he and the audience could not foresee what came next. The crisp $100 hovered between them like a bridge between two worlds, one of affluence, one of survival. Raymond's fingers trembled near the money, but something inside him stopped him. Not that he didn't need it, not due to lack of desire, but no one had ever made him earn their kindness. His existence was a series of closed doors, silent judgments, and hesitant handouts, never a chance or challenge. His throat was tight. "What if I fail?" he said softly. Morgan Freeman, still crouching at his level, tilted his head slightly. His eyes, which have communicated stories to millions, held a surprise. "That's the thing about trying, Raymond," he continued, voice steady. "Failure is part of the deal, but quitting is a choice." The words landed heavier than Raymond expected. Was he ready to pick something else? He nodded after a slow exhale. "Okay, done." The bill fell into his shaking hand. Morgan grinned, not as a winner in a silent war of wills, but as someone who knew how to reach out and grasp something true. And the darkness changed, but none understood how much would alter in the hours to come. After Morgan stood, Raymond sat still for a while. He could feel the gaze of pedestrians burning into him, some intrigued, some unsure, most indifferent. He had money earlier, but not like this, never with expectations. His instinct was to go to the booze store and forget life for a few hours. But suddenly he sensed it, the tiny piece of paper snuggled against the banknote, the one Morgan had placed into his hand, unseen. His heart raced. He found an address, a local resource center he had heard of but never visited, by carefully unfolding it. At the bottom, in smooth, careful strokes, "Say Morgan sent you." Raymond swallowed hard. There it was, the true option. He closed his eyes, inhaled forcefully, and pushed himself up off the chilly pavement. He didn't stop at the booze store. He didn't walk aimlessly like he had on so many evenings. He moved slowly, each step heavier with the understanding that tonight was different. The Hope Outreach Center wasn't far, just a 10-minute stroll through dimly lighted streets. Raymond felt like he was entering a new reality. The building was a simple brick structure between a laundromat and a closed bookstore. The sidewalk glowed with warm light from the windows. For a time, Raymond paused. What if they turned him away? What if this was simply another moment of false hope? He felt the $100 cash in his palm and tightened his jaw. Tonight I help you, tomorrow you help you. With that notion blazing in his breast, he pushed open the door. Hope Outreach's interior was unexpected. He was greeted by clean walls, fresh coffee, and soft chatter instead of dim lights and crowded cots. A woman at the front desk, mid-50s, smart but kind-eyed, glanced up and took him in. She was unfazed, no judgment, didn't check him. "Can I help you?" she inquired, her tone professional yet kind. Raymond swallowed the lump in his throat. "Yeah." He hesitated, then brought out the scrap of paper. "Morgan Freeman told me to come here." Silence. Then she looked up with recognition. Her lips slowly smiled. "I wondered when you'd arrive." She pointed to a free chair. "Hang on, let's begin." Raymond sat down, fists clenched, his thoughts racing with questions. And as he sat there, he had no idea that at that precise moment, his narrative was already spreading across the country. Elsewhere in the city, a video was making ripples on social media. It shows the moment Morgan Freeman crouched to Raymond's level, shot by a passerby that night. The talk was obvious. "Sir, could you spare $1? And what would you do with that dollar, my friend? Help me tonight and I'll help you tomorrow." The video became viral. People participated, they interacted, they argued, they responded. Giving more than money is how you really help. Morgan Freeman shows respect isn't riches. It's how you treat others. Did "Tell them Morgan sent you" make anyone cry? Raymond's name and story were already known by millions when he met with the intake worker at Hope Outreach. Raymond hardly had time to understand what was happening before he was escorted into a small office, where a staff member sat across from him. "Okay, Raymond," she answered, looking at the document. "Let's discuss your needs." And for the first time in a long time, he wasn't just another anonymous man on the street. He was more than a statistic, a warning, or a bother. He was spotted. He was important. He knew that this was more than simply a night off the streets as he sat there, listening to the possibilities being laid out before him. Temporary housing, work programs, counseling. It was the first step toward more. But the shock. Raymond wasn't the only one facing upheaval. Somewhere in the city, Morgan Freeman sat in a quiet cafe, oblivious of the maelstrom his simple gesture had unleashed. He didn't want attention. He wasn't in it for the press. He did it because it was right. But as he sipped his coffee, watching the rain drizzle against the window pane, his phone buzzed with a notification. The video became viral. Morgan knew for the first time Raymond wasn't the only one. It was about us all. The instant the video of Morgan Freeman and Raymond reached the internet, it was like a match dropped into parched grass. At first, it traveled silently, shared by a few accounts and commented on by those who found it. But then things changed. Engagement soared. A famous journalist retweeted the clip saying, "True kindness is giving hope, not just money." Then it spread rapidly. It was seen by millions in hours. Everyone from celebrities to activists to news anchors was talking about the quiet but powerful exchange between a Hollywood icon and a homeless man on a Chicago street corner. On the surface, it was only a minute, but it became a statement to the globe, a test, a call to action. Raymond was unaware that his life was about to change as social media exploded. Raymond sat in a small, cozy office at Hope Outreach with his hands clasped. Across from him, Lisa, a caseworker in her early 40s, looked through his documentation. She had worked with hundreds of people like him, men and women who had slipped between the cracks, some with hope still glowing in their eyes, others too spent to even attempt. But Ray, He was unique. He wasn't only here for refuge, he wasn't just looking for a dinner. He had walked through the door because of a promise. Lisa folded her hands, looking at him intently. "So, Raymond," she replied, leaning slightly forward. "What's your wish?" The question was easy, but Raymond found it unbearably weighty. He could have said work. He might have said lodging, but he was astonished by what he said. "I want my life back." Lisa smiled knowingly after studying him. "Let's begin." The next morning, a Hope Outreach staffer raced into Raymond's first job training session. "Raymond," she said, panting, "someone's calling you." Raymond scowled. He got no calls. Curious, he followed her down the hall to a small office where she handed him the receiver. "Hello?" he said cautiously. A break. Then a voice he hadn't heard in 10 years. "Ray?" Raymond's entire body stiffened. His knuckles whitened on the phone cord. "Paul?" he muttered, incredulous. His younger sibling, the man he hadn't spoken to in a decade, that was just the start of his surprises. Paul watched the video. He was shocked to see his older brother, whom he once idolized, sitting on a Chicago street corner, unrecognizable. In that moment, all bitterness, resentment, and lost years vanished. "I didn't know where you were," Paul said, his voice husky with sorrow. "I thought you were dead." Raymond gulped hard, attempting to grasp the weight of it all. "I thought you didn't want me," he said. Paul gasped. "Ray, I never stopped looking." Silence hung between them, not painful but fragile, a hopeful thing. "Where do we go from here?" Paul asked after a pause. Raymond blinked away, the sting in his eyes. "I'm working on that." But while Raymond was mending his personal life, another storm was brewing, one that involved Morgan Freeman himself. By now, the video had exploded. News stations around the country had picked up the topic, debating it on morning talk shows, primetime news pieces, even overseas broadcasts. A reporter said, "The most powerful moment of the year, an act of kindness that is changing a man's life in real time." Another headline said, "Why Morgan Freeman's viral lesson in respect matters." Reporters hurried to gain an interview with Morgan, but he refused to speak. He hated the spotlight, but the world wouldn't let it go. Soon, the corporate elite, who generally overlooked stories like this, began to pay attention. Hope Outreach received several donations from people nationwide. "Tell Raymond we trust him." One afternoon, a woman with a folder approached Raymond as he reviewed his employment application at Hope Outreach. "Raymond," she replied, panting, "someone called wanting to meet you." Raymond lifted an eyebrow. "Who?" She gave him the folder. A business card was inside, and the name printed on it made his heart stop. Mitchell Harper, Harper & Company CEO, Construction, Chicago's largest construction firms. A firm that developed the skyline he had slept under for months, didn't just recruit individuals like him. He flipped the card, hands shaking. It said in neat, handwritten writing on the back, "Come see me. We could use a man like you." Raymond was shocked. Lisa smiled at his reaction. "Ray, you're not just getting a second chance," she added. "You're starting over." But before Raymond could move on, he had to do one last thing involving the man who started it all. Days later, Raymond stood outside a quiet cafe in downtown Chicago, heart racing. He requested Lisa to arrange the meeting. Morgan Freeman agreed. He took a steadying breath as he opened the door and saw the familiar figure by the window. Morgan looked up, slowly smiling. "Raymond," he greeted pleasantly. Raymond sat down across from him, swallowing his feelings. The cafe smelled of fresh coffee and warm pastries, unlike the cold wind outside. Inside, seated at a tiny table near the window, Morgan Freeman took a leisurely sip of his drink, his deep brown eyes monitoring the bustling city streets. He'd seen and done a lot, but tonight felt different. When the door chimed softly, he looked up. Raymond stood there with a tidy button-down shirt and slightly worn but pressed slacks. He stood straighter. His hands were steady. His eyes, once filled with doubt, held something else entirely. Determination. Morgan grinned. "Raymond," he said, nodding to the chair opposite from him. "Sit." Raymond did, but hesitated first. He was ready for this talk. He just never anticipated it would happen like this. Raymond cleared his throat and put his hands on the table. "I don't know where to start," he said, surprisingly steady. Morgan laughed and put his cup down. "Well," he reflected, "most people start with thank you." Raymond breathed a quiet laugh, shaking his head. He said, "We both know this was more than just a simple act of kindness." Morgan nodded, then paused before speaking again. "Raymond, what's new?" Raymond exhaled slowly and chose his words. "Everything," he said finally. "Not just my situation, but how I see myself. For the first time in years, I feel seen." Morgan leaned forward slightly, his eyes unflinching. "What made you realize that?" Raymond swallowed, recalling the night on the icy pavement when everything changed. "It wasn't the cash," he said. "You stopped and looked at me like I was worth something." Morgan nodded after studying him for a while. "That's the thing about respect, Raymond," he stated calmly. "It should be given freely, not earned." Raymond pressed his lips together, emotion tightening in his chest. He thought he was nothing for years. And yet, here he was, sitting across from Morgan Freeman having a conversation as equals. Raymond wasn't the only one whose life had changed, and he was about to learn how far this moment had extended. Morgan slipped a folded newspaper across the table as Raymond grabbed for his coffee. "Have you seen this?" he questioned. Raymond frowned and opened the paper. And then, his breath stuck in his throat. His face was on the first page. The headline read, "One kind act starts a national trend." Raymond scanned the paper, his heart thumping. It wasn't only him. Morgan Freeman's promise to a homeless man that night and the journey that followed had become more than just a viral video. People nationwide began donating to homeless shelters, volunteering at outreach programs, and giving second chances. And all because of one chat. Raymond looked up, his eyes wild. This is real?" Morgan smiled, his expression both proud and knowing. "It's real," he confirmed. "And this is just the start." But Raymond didn't know this movement was about to get more personal. Before Raymond could grasp the weight of what was happening, Morgan reached into his pocket, pulling out a little packet. "Someone wanted me to give you this," he continued, sliding it over the table. Raymond hesitated, his fingers trembling as he picked it up. The front handwriting was known, too familiar. He opened the envelope slowly, his chest tightening, and took out a paper. Then he saw it, a name he hadn't said in 10 years. Paul, his younger sibling. His hands gripped the letter, his mind racing. "Where'd you get this?" he inquired quietly. Morgan reclined. "Your story reached him, Raymond," he said simply. "He's been looking for you." Raymond felt his throat close up. He had spent so many years feeling he had been forgotten, and now the proof that someone still cared was sitting right in front of him. But before he could properly grasp this news, Morgan had one last surprise. Raymond folded the letter carefully, pressing it to his chest. "I don't know what to say," he said, his voice thick with emotion. Morgan smiled, finishing the last sip of his coffee. "Then don't speak," he said. "Just use it." Raymond nodded, his mind already spinning with options. But then Morgan delved into his pocket one last time and took out a small old key. Raymond scowled. "What's this?" Morgan laid it on the table between them. "A door," he replied simply, "one that leads to your next life chapter." Raymond ran his thumb over the key. It wasn't just any key, it was a house, a new beginning, a second chance. His eyes swam as he looked up, but Morgan merely grinned. "You kept your word, Raymond," he said. "Now the world can see what you can do." Raymond knew his story was just beginning. That night, Raymond left the cafe a new man. Not simply for the work, not just due to the movement his tale ignited, but he believed in himself again for the first time in years. Morgan Freeman knew one thing for sure as he watched him vanish into the city lights. Respect is free, but it may change the world if offered at the appropriate time. Raymond stood outside his new apartment with a key, feeling like everything had gone full circle. The cold nights, empty pockets, and hopelessness brought him here. But his own change wasn't what struck him most. It changed others. He met Evan Grant unexpectedly after volunteering at Hope Outreach one night. The same man who had formerly taunted him on the streets now stood before him, appearing oddly apprehensive. Raymond, Evan said, adjusting his coat. I saw the interviews, read the articles. He trailed off, massaging the back of his neck. Raymond waited silently. I was wrong about you, Evan said, sighing. On many topics. Raymond sensed something new in the man. Sorrow, not pride or pity. I thought people like you were just looking for an easy way out, Evan said. But after everything, after seeing what you've done, I get it now. Sometimes all someone needs is for one person to stop and see them. Raymond studied him, then shook his hand. Then maybe you should socialize more. Evan paused, then shook his hand, a simple gesture. But it meant everything, because in the end, Raymond hadn't only improved his own life, he altered another's too. Morgan Freeman observed, how you treat people says more about you than it ever will about them. That night in Chicago was more than a sidewalk chat. It was about dignity, second chances, and how one moment can change a life. Respect isn't money. Kindness isn't charity. We choose how we see and treat each other daily. And sometimes the smallest act of acknowledgement can be the most life-changing thing of all. This anecdote shows that respect and kindness are not just for the rich or successful. They are humanity's basis. A moment of real connection can change our lives and others' lives. We learn that people are more than their situations. Status shouldn't dictate dignity. Second chances are made, not granted. Most importantly, we see that everyone we pass has a story, a past and a future to rewrite. And maybe, just maybe, it takes only one person willing to stop and listen to begin that change. Top of form, bottom of form.